and thank you so much to the artists for coming out. I feel really, really lucky to have 3 of the 4 artists here. I feel very lucky to have their work here in the gallery, and I feel really blessed to have them here to talk to you about their work. So I'm going to start just by reading you little bios of each of the artists, and then I'm just going to make a little statement about the show, and then I'm going to open it up to the artists. Next to me is Susan Homer. Susan is the artist that did the very dense floral pieces. There's 2 in the back. They all have birds in them, 2 in the back. These 2 big ones in the front, and then this small still life in the window. Susan Homer was born in Boston and raised on the North Shore of Massachusetts. She lives and works in Brooklyn, New York, and is that Bremen? Bremen, Maine. She received her BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design and her MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She also attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Drawing in Maine in 2011. Oh, third period. There, sorry about that. Maine. In 2011, she was awarded the Marie Walsh Art Foundation Space Grant, which is a wonderful, really prestigious, great thing to receive. She exhibits her work in New York and other places, and is held in private collections throughout the United States, including the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company, LLC, and the University of New Mexico Art Museum. Lowell Boyers is the gentleman on the end, and his work is on the opposite end in a way. It's dense in that there's a lot going on in his work, but it's also very open. He's the artist who did the thinner watercolor and ink and acrylic pieces. 2 little ones, 1 large one in the back, and this piece, the tall one in the back, and then this big one. Lowell Boyers is a contemporary painter, often working in a variety of materials such as acrylic resins and inks, and blending figurative and abstract imagery. Boyers received his BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design and his MFA from Yale University. His work has been the subject of exhibitions worldwide, including in Cologne, Abu Dhabi, New York, Los Angeles, Houston, and Dallas. Charles Yuen, his work they're the thicker paintings. I would say kind of less of a refined touch, very painterly. So he's got this piece here, the one in the back, the big red one, and about 3 little ones and a big one in the back. So Charles Yuen has had several one-person and numerous group exhibitions since moving to New York City in 1981. One-person shows include Studio 10 Bushwick, Elizabeth Harris Gallery, New York, Art in General in New York, Asian American Art Center in New York, Metaphor Contemporary Art, Brooklyn, and the list goes on. Group shows include nonprofit art spaces as well as private galleries, Artist Space, New Museum, Brooklyn Museum of Art, Newark Museum, Exit Art, Pierogi, Scope London, and it goes on. Charles has a very impressive resume. Mr. Yuen has been the proud recipient of the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in 2018, the Adolph and Esther Gottlieb Foundation Artist Grant in 2011, the Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant in Artist Projects, New York State Regional Initiative Grant, Rockefeller Foundation, Andy Warhol, NEA, and was awarded an artist in residency at the Asian Arts Institute in 1983 or 4. Critically, Yuen's work is usually appraised in the psychological space within the fabric of both formal concerns and revealing humor. Reviews of his last exhibition have appeared in Art Critical, Hyperallergic, Art Fuse. Reviews have also appeared in numerous publications, including Art America, New York Times, Time Out, Brooklyn Rail, Cover Art Papers, etc. Represented primarily in private collections. Public collections are University of Virginia, the State Foundation for Culture and the Arts Collection, and the Honolulu Museum of Art. Originally from Hawaii, Yuen earned a BFA from the University of Hawaii and an MFA from Rutgers University. He currently lives and works in Brooklyn. So, as you can see from what I have just read you, I feel very lucky to have these artists here with me and us. So, the theme of the show is a little bit complicated, so what I decided to do is I'm going to read you a quote from a book, and then I'll say just a couple words about it. The book is a book called Alone with the Alone, which was written by he's a philosopher. He was a philosopher, a Sufi mystic named Henri Corbin, and this is a quote from the book. Between the universe that can be apprehended by pure intellectual perception and the universe perceptible to the senses, there is an intermediate world, the world of idea images, of archetypal figures, of subtle substances, of immaterial matter. This world is as real and objective, as consistent and subsistent as the intelligible and sensible worlds. It is an intermediate universe where the spiritual takes body and the body becomes spiritual, a world consisting of real matter and real extension, though by comparison to sensible, corruptible matter, these are subtle and immaterial. The organ of this universe is the active imagination. It is the place of theophanic visions, the scene on which visionary events and symbolic histories appear in their true reality. Here we shall have a good deal to say of this universe, but the word imaginary will never be used, because with its present ambiguity, this word, by prejudging the reality attained or to be attained, betrays an inability to deal with this at once intermediate and intermediary world. So that kind of says it all better, certainly a lot better than I could say. But I just want to add, those of you who are in art therapy, have any of you talked at all about James Hillman? So James Hillman, I don't know, maybe when you get to further into your graduate degree. He was a post-Jungian. He worked with Jung, and then he kind of diverged from Jung at some point. He's an archetypal psychologist, and he was a huge fan of Henri Corbin. James Hillman wrote, well, he didn't write a book. This book, The Thought of the Heart and the Soul of the World, this is actually a talk that he gave that was called The Thought of the Heart, and The Soul of the World is an essay that he wrote. So the show is named after this book. And so Hillman, kind of basing his ideas on Henri Corbin, came up with this practice that he called soul making. And so soul making is basically the process that Corbin described in the quote that I just read, which is working with images to access this place that exists between the world of the senses, so this world that we perceive in our everyday life, and the world of the mind, which is completely ethereal. So soul making works with images to kind of access this place that Hillman and Corbin believe to be at least as real as this world that we exist in, if not more real. And to Hillman, soul is beauty. Soul is psyche, and psyche is beauty. And so when it's a theme that's very meaningful to me, very close to my heart, and I wanted to choose artists who create images that speak through beauty, and create spaces or images that feel real in a way that is not the way we usually think of as real. So, we think of representational art as what is real. But to me, these artists create images and spaces that seem to me to imply a place or a thing that has its own autonomy. And that's something that's really important to the imaginal. And in what I read to you, Corbin said at the end, we will not use the word imaginary, because imaginary, it implies something that is not real, whereas imaginal means something that exists in that place between this world of matter and the completely ethereal world that you can access through the mind. And so it's this autonomy, the autonomy of the image, or the autonomy of whatever is happening in the work. I think I can refer to any of these pieces as image, as well as a sculpture as image. And so it's a very special show to me, because I feel like it's got this kind of magical quality to it, to the work independently and then together as a show. I feel like it kind of takes me into a place where it's almost like the work has almost more autonomy than I do. It presents itself as being more real than the world in which I exist. So I'm going to open it up to you. You can respond to this idea in so far as how you feel. If you feel like your work kind of, if that makes sense in relation to your work. I know, Susan, you said that it was kind of the perfect theme for you, and then I went and I read your statement, and I thought, I mean, it's very satisfying as an artist to feel like, you've communicated what you wanted to communicate. And when I read your statement, I thought, oh, this is perfect. So, I don't know, you could talk a little bit about that. If you remember what
my statement is.
I have it here.
Yeah, let me look at it.
I have everything.
Okay, yeah, that's right. So I think I paint a lot. I paint a lot of things from life. So I paint trees from life, and I do landscape painting, and I paint my garden and birds. But I also paint a lot from other sources, from books and from other art, from a lot of decorative art, wallpaper and fabric, all sorts of different things. And I combine them in a way that I think is, I like the idea that they feel real within the context of the painting, but that they're not observational in the way that's traditional observational work is.
So you're creating this space that feels consistent within itself
Yeah.
and has this, its own sense of reality.
Yeah, and I'm interested in a sort of a folkloric idea, maybe my own folklore of New England, and I love Emily Dickinson and Louisa May Alcott, and I think about women writers, and somehow it's all connected to that as well. And then I think about I'm really a modernist painter. I think about the paint and what the language of the paint as being more real than the language of the images, and somehow that fusion too, if you can get, there's a sort of flickering point where both are speaking, and I find that really interesting.
That is interesting. I forgot what I was gonna say. You made me think of something and then I got taken by wherever you went with that.
A flickering material,
Flickering.
yeah, what's inside and what's outside of you.
This isn't what I was gonna say, but where did oh, I know what I was gonna say, that, that poetry is, I think it's a way of kind of accessing this imaginal space that's very direct. It seems like, people who get into working with the idea of the imaginal go very naturally to poetry. There's something about the language of poetry that is able to kind of create, I don't know, I guess maybe because the words are specific enough that we understand them, and yet you can speak in a way that's poetic.
The words are a medium, and the letters are a medium, and then the way you put them together as an image gives you.
Right.
So in that way.
Yes, you can paint images with words, so that can kind of make the idea maybe a little bit more clear, because you're talking with language, with verbal language. So where did the birds come from specifically?
Wow, I've always looked at birds. I've always watched birds, and I think my grandmother and my father were bird watchers, and so I had a life list as a little girl, and I've always loved them, and we fed them and had them, and so.
It's interesting that, I brought the bigger work in here, and then when the whole thing was hung, I wanted to have one of your small pieces, and I've always been such a huge fan. Susan has a whole series of still life paintings that she's done, a few of them without birds, but most of them with birds. This very kind of, I don't know what you call that pattern of China, but it's very, like my grandmother had China like that.
Yeah.
Lots of pattern in them, and these birds, and I thought, well, those are very imaginal too, just because they're more recognizable in a way. They're almost more imaginal because they really, it's like you can believe it, but it's also
Really
absolutely
unlikely.
very unlikely. Yes. Yeah.
But I like that.
Yeah, and I'm glad that I managed to get those in. All right. We can have, after everyone's done speaking, we're gonna hear all of your 2 questions each.
Should I jump in? Okay. Well, I'm picking up on your poetry comment, because I feel in my work that I too am really attracted to poetry, but on a structural level rather than on the word level, because maybe 2 reasons. One is I love how in poetry everything has multiple meanings. Okay, so it's not fixed meaning, and so that's what I go for in my work, as well as the process of poetry, of poetic rather than, say, hardcore rationale or rationality. So, in regards to representation and reality, I find like super realist paintings or photographs to be very unreal. I don't think of them as a representation of reality. Because to me, this is looping the poetry back in, when we approach an object or a person or an event, it's not just a phenomenal thing, that's a table. But when I see that table, it brings back memories. I locate it in maybe a modernism and the history of modernism rather than, say, a Baroque table or something. So every object, every event, every person, there's a whole flood of associations that I bring to it, and each one of us bring to everything we do, that I think just the visual patina of similarity does not address, and that we can get at better representations or better evocations, I think, rather than evocations of subjects through not necessarily a photographic reproduction of it, but trying to bring a poetic, the richness of poetry to an event. So for instance, in that painting there, it's kind of an illustration almost of what I'm saying. So growing out of this person's head are all these colorful orbs, right? And weird little thoughts and things. And then they all end in these weird characters with their hands up. And I was thinking of them as kind of like flowers, you know? But hey, this is a pretty recent painting. And so hands up, you know? I wanted to address, the racial disparities, as well as, and what I really enjoyed about while work. So my paintings are processes of discovery for myself too, so they're not pre-planned. But the minute I put in that orange space between the arms, I thought, wow, these figures are beginning to glow as if they were religious icons, kind of like halo-like. And I love the idea of transforming a victim into a blessed thing or event or something. So that was some of my thinking behind that, where they are driven more by poetic association. And I find that as a painter, it's a lot more exciting than just trying to mutely copy something.
And what you said about, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
Go ahead.
What you said about the table, that's exactly what James Hillman, I think, has in mind when he's talking about working with images and the way that we perceive the world. It's not just a table, but it's an image.
Yeah, it's trying to make it more real, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's why Corbin said it's more real. And I remember somebody I used to know say Van Gogh is, his images are so much more real than, a really realistic looking painting. And there is something about, here we could call the soul of the artist and the expression that somehow, there's something about, I'm thinking about Starry Night, because probably half the people here just love Starry Night is their favorite painting. There's a magical quality to being under a night sky that can't be expressed in just something that's like, I don't know if you've used the word veneer, but I think that's a really important point, and it's something especially important for college students, because I think that, you're at an age where there's so much emphasis put on making something that other people can recognize as, skillful. Like, that person's a good artist because they can make that look like that. And, then the question I would ask is, so what? Why does that make somebody a good artist? Why is that more important? I mean, they may be very skillful, and that's good, but the other thing is, also, what do you have to prove to other people? Why is it that you need to show other people that you can do that when you may want to, and that's fine. There's a lot of representational work that I think is beautiful, great work, or maybe not beautiful, great work, but that's not the only measure of a great artist.
I find, and I think a lot of painters find this also, is one of the difficult things is, when is a piece done?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when is that painting finished? And for me, it's when all the elements in that painting have somehow come together to, when they come together and create that magic that you mentioned.
I wonder if you feel this way. My husband, who's a painter, I think he works in a very similar way to what you do, and you know, he will just go through so many iterations of a painting that I think, you know, that was a beautiful painting. But I think it's until it has meaning for him. You know, it could be a great image, but until it resonates with him and says to him something that is meaningful, it's not done.
Right, yeah.
Well?
Yeah. You know, I was thinking of the figures at the ends as just other versions, like kind of blossomings of that figure.
Oh, right, and
You know, so you know that there are these kind of other dimensional cells, you know, arising.
And it's cactus-like, you know, it's
It
very
is,
plant-like.
yeah, for sure, and jewel-like, yeah. All of these things are so interesting that we've been talking about. I think what's come to mind is a memory of this yogi that I met had said that the mind is the most innermost part of the body, and the body the most outermost part of the mind. That anything that our bodies, our senses, come in contact with, hearing, smelling, touching, feeling, thoughts, all these things are mind, you know, our mind. And that seems to resonate in light of this conversation, and it's definitely relevant to my work. You know, I've been calling these things innerscapes, but really they're inner and outer scapes. You know, the idea that the landscape of our lives are not wholly external, you know, or not external, you know, that they're in union, some kind of alchemy. And I'm aware of that being manifest in all the paintings, not my own, not just my own, but yours very much so. You know, this sense of your work with this kind of flickering phenomenon, both ornamentation, kind of representation, very intense representation, then this kind of incredible sense of ornament and pattern, which is just how you see that world, and I feel that flickering phenomenon in your work as well. You know, this, as you said, these kind of constructed, I don't know how to describe them, but unit kind of growths are, you know, seem to be doing this as well. This sense of like some kind of origin that kind of is constantly manifesting and blossoming and growing, kind of being encapsulated. And yeah,
I was kind of thinking that what we're doing is we're listening with our eyes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Very much so. I like that a lot. Yeah.
Pretty good one.
That's a really astute observation, you know, now that you say this thing about blossoming. There is so much kind
There's a
of,
lot of energetic, you know,
yeah,
expression. Yeah.
I think you talk in your statement, as I would expect, about impermanence and constant changing of things.
That's
and
right.
there is something of that in all the work.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I'm interested in, I'm interested in the process of just the kind of, how should I say, fertile void of a naked canvas, you know, that things can arise from it and also kind of dissipate back into it, and that to kind of affirm that through process and through imagery, that it can mirror our experience of that same phenomena in life, that the sense of things happening and then dissipating and new things arising, in that way, life is more kind of, kind of colorful and vaporous at the same time, rather than enveloping, or like we were talking about poetry, this sense of poetry being the texture of meaning rather than a kind of illustration of meaning, tight and fixed, the way certain kinds of writing can do, and quite masterfully. But poetry alludes to things in a way rather than spells it out, spells it out. And
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying relates again to, the way that we perceive things compared to the way things really, if we're gonna say they really exist in one way, and that we see things as these discrete shapes when in reality, everything is flowing. There's, at least energy that flows between people. There's all kinds of things that we don't see, because either they're happening too fast or they're not, within our capability of seeing. And so it's that kind of stripping away of that kind of solid exterior that I think you quote illustrate so well in your paintings.
oh, thank you.
I mean, there's definitely a flickering.
Yeah, I'm looking for a flickering one.
Flickering reminds me
one
of.
too.
I once heard Jacques Derrida speak, and he talked about, I think he was referring to seeing, and that for him it was kind of like flickering, like rapid eye blinking, where you're observing as well as thinking, and those things are melding to create. So that's the flicker, where you have something that exists in two states at once.
We don't have the metaphor anymore as much as, young people don't have the metaphor for film the way we do at our age, but that idea, the idea of images with a little, void between, this kind of image. I have that in my mind that every blink is like when the projector is kind of just fluttering. Again, digitally you don't have this, but it's
But we all have mind farts,
Yeah, we do.
Kind of like the
lots
flicker.
of those. For sure.
Well, shall we open it up to questions?
Sure.
I know you all have questions. Danielle, you look like you have a question.
I do have a question, sure. So I have a question for that one back there. And that's yours.
Yep.
This may be because I'm in a modern art class,
Uh-huh.
and so have that influence.
Perfect.
But when I saw it, I thought of Gustav Klimt's The Kiss. That
Oh, right,
is-
uh-huh.
And it might be just because of the shape.
And
was
something about the palette a little bit.
Yeah, maybe. I was just wondering if that may have been an influence for you or not.
Well, that painting is so iconic, I don't see how it couldn't
Yeah.
be an influence, because you absorb things in it. Now, I did not say, I want to do a painting about the Kiss, or Klimt, but what I did say, speaking of modern and modernism, is I wanted to do a painting of paintings. So, the painting of pictures, and of course, so, then what I bring to that is this kind of quirky, you may notice that the picture frames are not straight up. I mean, they're like weirder picture frames, because it's like that. Well, I view myself as really interfacing with surrealism quite a bit. So there's a few echoes from time with that, you know, in terms of those aesthetics. Yeah, so it was, in a sense, like modernist art, it was self-reflexive, but my joke was that it's not formally self-reflexive, it's narratively self-reflexive. So I embrace humor a lot in my work, and so that was one of the jokes in that painting. The other one was the rainbow, of course, which is, I don't know, I'm not that optimistic.
You're so playful.
It's also a really good example of there's somebody who used something, a motif or an image that could be very cliche, a rainbow, and used it in a way that, I mean, it's kind of.
I was trying to play off of the cliche of,
It's
you know,
very
and it was like,
conscious.
oh, should I put a unicorn in there?
And you could pull that off.
I still haven't done a unicorn. Yeah, right, I've been thinking about it, but.
Danielle, did you know that this painting is called, I forget I know what within the brackets, but
Anticipation.
Anticipation,
And
Remembering Klimt.
Oh,
Yeah.
I heard you mention Klimt in the hallway, and I thought you were talking about that painting.
that's kind of an interesting vector, because your paintings are so
Yeah.
jewel-like, you know, in terms of.
I think I look at Clint.
Yeah.
I don't know if
I would miss it. Especially that.
I think
yeah.
I did look at Clint.
Yeah.
So can I ask a follow-up question?
Oh, there's my modern art professor.
We didn't look at the, to be fair, we didn't look at the Adele Rock Valley portrait, so she might not know. I don't think we did.
I just thought she might have seen the title of that painting,
Oh.
because Klimt is in the title.
Oh, I see. I don't know if the Adele Rock Valley portrait was the, anyway. it doesn't-
No.
No, okay. So I appreciate your comment, Charles, about sort of, we haven't gotten to surrealism yet. So,
Oh, okay.
and there's a way in which, when you said that, yes, of course, right, there's an element of the sky and the sort of otherworldly space within those little frames. And so whether or not, I'm wondering for all of the artists, because this is something I'm trying to have our students think about in modern art, is that there's an awareness for fine artists, professional artists, of the sort of place they are within history, and whether or not they're sort of self-conscious about, you know, surrealism or Gustav Klimt. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about if there's an awareness of past art forms, and whether or not you are self-consciously sort of thinking of that, responding to that, or if it's just more of a sort of a subtle thing.
For me, there is an awareness.
Okay.
It's not the primary drive, though, but I have this weird, quirky theory that probably I'll get destroyed for, but I felt like art kind of made a wrong turn at modernism. That it's, you know, entering into the 20th century, it's chugging along fine, and then we get to basically the theories around the abstract expressionists, and they start talking about flatness, and I don't know if it's getting obscure, but but there was this sort of modernity, and I felt like the conversation was hijacked by formalism, and that other fruitful pathway coming from surrealism atrophied with that. So we hit Picasso, and then the surreal starts to disappear, and it starts to move into minimalism or whatever. So it's very formal, and that's a very materialist, a very rational way of approaching art, and I sort of miss the quirky flights of imagination, and so I decided I wanted to embed my work in that path not taken, and I also noticed in looking at art history that at the time anyway, and this is the ancient 80s, that a lot of art was very aggressive, that a lot of painters were trying to make an impression on their audiences, we have pop art and bright colors and just, it's really aggressive. And that wasn't reflecting my reality. I wanted to do work that was kind of the opposite. It was about space falling in on itself. And I felt like the world I was living in was too catastrophic for this optimistic aggression, And so I wanted to have a reticent space. So that was also anti-modernist, I guess, at the time.
It's interesting what, okay. What you say about surrealism, I think that your work is kind of a testament to the truth of what you're saying, because I feel like surrealism, there would be automatists, they were called, and then whatever the other kind of surrealists were called, the Dalis, the Magritte. And I feel like there was so much more that could have been done. And like when I think of surrealism, I don't have a lot of great associations, but what I identify as surrealist in terms of art history, it's very limited.
Right.
It's
yeah.
Whereas, your work, I would not, although I understand why you say it's got.
Yeah, I don't consider myself a surrealist.
Right, but
no.
it's got connections to it, and it's not at all, and yet it's not at all.
But I don't paint for art history either, nor do I paint to fit into a, I don't think any of us do.
No, I don't.
I think our motivations are otherwise.
Yeah,
Do you think,
kind of
do you
falls
think,
away. Oh,
do you
go
think
ahead.
Dustin got hammered for that? I mean, he was in that abstract expressionism and, and then all of a sudden he starts doing these new things and they were like, well, okay, he's done. And they kind of left him out at pasture for about 20 years. But now, when you look at Dustin's work, he
That's
brought-
what you're looking at.
Yeah, exactly.
He won the contest.
Yeah, he sure did.
Right?
Yeah, he was hammered.
Yeah, he was, yeah.
But notice it was the market that hammered him.
Right.
There were a lot of artists.
And the
that
artists were
really-
like, whoa.
I mean, I think, there's this thing that happens, I think, as, you mature as an artist, that, where a lot of the concepts of belonging or even of intention in a way slightly fall away, because the process or voice of the artist begins to kind of take over. And then there's this kind of marveling when you're walking through museums or galleries or whatever, and you have kinship with people that you may not have even imagined or conceived. It opens up in a very different way. Whereas when you're young, there's a sense of urgency and of intention, kind of concept of belonging and resisting and all these things that I think fundamentally begin all that artifice because of process and commitment to process, begins to just.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you start a painting?
I usually get a bunch of stuff to look at, and then I paint a background, and then I just start painting things.
Okay.
And then I start painting things out, and then I
Right.
put more things
Okay.
in
So, but you're not doing
a sketch.
10 studies.
No, and
yeah,
I don't
okay.
know what it's gonna look like.
Right, and you don't.
I have
Right.
no
That
idea.
was And I'm assuming that's
Same.
true
I
for you.
paint flat sawhorses, so they're like tabletops, almost like abstract expressionists who are on the floor or something,
Mhm.
depending on the scale.
Right. You start doing
And I'm just basically pouring diaphanous pores of color. I don't know top, bottom,
And you
anything.
just start to.
I just wait for a kind of energetic compression of something to begin to elicit some dynamic.
I'm similar in that I start with a thumbnail about this big that bears no relationship to the finished product. But I guess what I was getting at was the organicness of our process, where kind of looping back to the poetry thing, where you're painting and responding to the painting. So it's a conversation, right? That we're having with the work.
I have lots of books. My other job is I'm an editor. So I have all these books and I take them apart and I'll just hang up a bunch of things from art history or from whatever that I like when I'm working on a painting. And then I keep looking at it and
Right, it
sometimes
becomes
I'll,
part of your.
and it's sort of, it might just be a color that I like, or it might actually be a flower, it might be a pattern, it could be really almost anything. But I have, and that's always changing as I'm working on the painting.
Mhm.
And I think, Lowell, it's interesting with your work because it was figurative, and then I imagine it was a very organic process that
Yeah.
caused this change from figurative to more landscape oriented.
Yeah, I may return back, I mean, you know, I'm not really sure, but just the figure just started dissolving more, you know, and that just, I don't know, I wasn't really doing it intentionally. It just kind of happened, and then it just made sense to kind of, I almost think of it as like taking a lens and just moving, you know, closer into the paint, and then a whole other world or inner world is kind of manifesting. Now
that's
I've got other shapes and representational forms that are being discovered just accidentally, you know, like one thing. All of a sudden I'm using boats. I'm not even zero nautical anything, you know, but
That's a great metaphor.
yeah, exactly. It kind of really just came
Boats
from
with
shape.
wings on them.
Yeah,
that's
boats
like
with
terrific.
wings. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't know. It just kind of happened.
And I also want to acknowledge the language that Lowell used, which was, what did you say, that you said something was that the figures were, I don't know if you said they were dissolving, or there was something that you said, and it was like, he was not taking ownership of what was happening in the painting, like I made this happen, I started changing the figures into boats, that, the figures started to dissolve and then something else happened, and that relates to what I was saying about the imaginal, that these things have a life of their own. I mean, this is true of I think probably most art in the way it's made, but just to really acknowledge that and wanted to point that out, that process to just kind of, I always say that you want to get into a place where accidents can happen. You want to kind of allow, accidents are always the best part of the work, I think. There's always like one little thing and it's like, I don't know how I did that and I'll never be able to do it again, because it's like you're channeling something. And I think that's, what you said.
Well, you force yourself upon it up to a certain point, and then it all of a sudden has, you realize it's got a mind of its own.
Yeah,
And
Or
starts to
there's like
resist.
always a back and forth
Yeah.
between the two.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like, oh my God, I like have, I take no part in what's happening here. And I think when you're young, there's a certain amount of attention that has to happen because you're just starting from nothing. But once you enter into something, then there's always this back and forth between, you kind of pushing up against it and it, or making something happen and then it responding to you.
I just had a quote, another quote came to mind of, I don't know where it's from, Bodhidharma maybe, of the mind and the world are one. So the mind and the world are one, and vision arises where they meet. And the idea of this inside-outside liminal space where these worlds, they're really one, but we are at the cusp or the boundary in a sense. And so a lot of the frustration of, where accident is maybe the world out there needing to reach us, and our mind maybe is not ready to let it in or to reach that intersection. So it's sort of
Yeah, and
Interesting
in
space.
connection to James Hillman, I think he said that, it's rather than him kind of perceiving the world, he is actually being kind of thought by the world. The world, he talks about the mundus and not the mundus imaginals, the anima mundi. The anima mundi is the world ensouled, that the world has an intelligence of its own, and that we are actually being thought by the world.
Am I the dream of a butterfly?
Right.
Well, many
Gets back to the
painters I
matrix.
talk with talk about admiring or wistfully. Many of the painters I talk with live for, there's these moments in painting, I think we've all experienced this, where you can do no wrong. It's like, wow, you're in the zone, and suddenly things just click. And then there's other days where you can't do anything right, but
And what is that?
yeah, but I was thinking that, maybe that's, wow, you've somehow gotten to that space of, where the world and, you got to that vision vector thing.
But it's inexplicable, how does that happen? Why?
Yeah, and you can't,
It's like,
I've
I
never.
didn't
That's
do
a fake
anything
art.
different.
Yeah. Right, I guess that's it, yeah, that's.
If you're thinking you're there, then you're not there.
Yeah, they're probably not there, yeah.
Someone else a question? Frank?
Okay, so I have a question for, I'm sorry, it's Yuen?
Charles?
Yeah, you want?
Okay, for this painting and that painting, they kind of like combine elements of both human and sort of plant-like elements?
Yeah,
Is there like
yeah.
I'm sorry, is there like a meaning behind it, or is that just a design decision?
I'm sorry, what was, did you say a
was that-
meaning back there? Or-
I'm sorry, was there like a meaning behind it? I'm sorry, or like.
Oh, meaning, oh, okay.
I'm sorry, sorry about that.
Kind of like mean bandit. Yeah. It's messing with definitions,
Oh,
basically. And I think by messing with definitions, I can maybe trigger in the audience, I can trigger the audience would mess with their own definitions. It's kind of like the humor. I mean, Freud talks about humor. It's where, things slip. And so you can get a little bit out of the rigidity of our own thought patterns by messing with the definitions.
Diane?
I was wondering about the process of painting these paintings.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me more about
More? Yeah, so again, I start with no plan. I don't do preliminary drawings or anything like that. And eventually, certain kinds of, I don't know the right word, almost like an animism or some kind of dynamic of energy begins to exert itself. Sometimes it's just the way the paint is kind of dried or moved, or, I have all of, once you're a certain age, there's a certain kind of, we all have a hand, a kind of, a touch, and that touch dictates certain kinds of shape and form for, to assist certain things to arise. And I'm kind of in concert with that thing, both abstractly, with no intention, and then with this kind of, a little bit of a real intention. And then slowly and slowly, after many, many layers, things, I just start making stuff. So maybe this painting, I just had this sense of openings, kind of little, I don't know, I was calling them big bangs, kind of like, almost like the senses. I'm saying this after the fact, by the way. I didn't exactly know what I was doing when I was doing it, but I've reflected on this painting many times, and I'm thinking of them as kind of these blossoming big bangs is what I've been calling them, where every time you have a sensation, there's this kind of opening, like, to the world, right? You know, wind, color, you know. And in that painting, it's almost like those same Big Bang are kind of almost taking wing, taking wing. And there's a different kind of quality of liberty associated with the figure's recognition of that thing. And in this, I was really thinking of these eruptions, almost these kind of little fiery, winged eruptions happening in the landscape. Is the landscape my landscape, like literally a body landscape, landscape of my mind, physical landscape, some archipelago? I don't really know, but that's how I kind of allow certain things to happen in certain kind of shapes and forms, begin to become developed over years from this play of discovery of intention, seeing. And there's some time between these three paintings, maybe a year and a half or so. So that's over 30 odd paintings have gone in from that painting to this painting, so it just all of a sudden happened, upon these shapes and forms through process, though. Not really, some concept of what these things mean or are gonna mean,
That's so interesting to me, without, getting into it too much. What I know about you and your interests in Tibetan Buddhism, they fit that so perfectly. It's so hard to believe that they're like, it just happened. I'm not doubting you, but it's amazing how your work illustrate the concepts, Buddhist philosophy. So, the boat to the other shore. There's so many things in there.
I think it's also very banal the way Charles was kind of describing. There is that moment of like having zero idea of what the hell I'm doing, and knowing fully well that every time I touch the canvas, I'm blowing it. And then simultaneously, like for maybe 40 minutes in a week, I might have the touch, and I'll be like, where did this, I try to put myself in the same place again and again, eat the same meal, listen to the same music, just whatever. Whatever I can do. I'm exaggerating, but there's a banality to it too, So it's, I'm telling a narrative about making that is there's a flourish to it, but there's a work to it, a labor, and
or as Leonard Cohen said, if I knew where the good songs came from, I'd go there more often. Exactly.
Mackenzie.
So you had all spoke about this lack of intentionality in that you allow your art to take shape. Similarly to the process of like painting with one's eyes closed, where you consider these pieces as stemming from the unconscious, because you all had mentioned there's some part that you have this closeness to, verbal Buddhist culture. Charles, the theme of discrimination, and for Susan, the birds. Do you think that this was just an unintentional kind of unconscious rising, or do you think that it was just coincidental? And maybe you can answer.
I think certainly things are unconscious. There's no question. So some things you really are consciously adding, and then some things you don't even know are there, and somebody else will say to you, "Oh, wow, that looks like this," or "This makes me think of that," and you didn't even think of it. You hadn't thought of that yourself. So I think painting is, for me, definitely about the unconscious, and that's part of the fun of it. Is that these things come out that you weren't expecting or didn't know were there, and they lead to the next thing.
For me, I think of it as discovery. So I'll muck around and something, oh, hey, this shape, or something will suggest something, which will suggest something. And so I then discover a metaphor or something like that. So yeah, definitely. It's a little different than unconscious, though, I think. I'm not exactly sure if I know how to
I agree.
describe it.
I think it's more like, for me,
Yeah.
you know, like unconscious implies to me a sense of not knowing or not being aware. Not being aware, maybe. You know, like knowing that you dreamt, but not knowing what the dream was, or something like that. And I don't think painting's, discovery is quite like that. There's this, there are moments that all the time where things are evolving and manifesting without a sense of, I don't want to say intentionality, because I've already used that word, but the sense of knowing what it's going to become, you know, like, but you still, in a mature way, are accepting that lots of things are like this, and that you're going to see where the river flows, you know, if that makes sense. It's kind of like, you ever have a dream where you're actually moving through the dream knowingly? Like, oh, I'm in this cool hall, I think I'll go down the hall.
Like
You ever know that
like
you're in a
lucid
dream? It's kind of like a lucid dream. You know, like when,
Right,
I
right,
have
right.
these, not every once in a while, you know, where you're kind of like, oh, I have some weird, I don't know what it is, a bungalow colony dream or something, and it's like, I don't know, and I know, I'm saying, it's, yeah, I'll tell you, and I'll be moving through, I know people are sleeping in the thing, and I'm moving through this field, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go across here and take a left. Not, you know, it's like knowing, but not, I know I'm in a dream. I don't know what everything means.
There's also a certain amount of trust
Yeah,
that
to
you
trust.
need, you know, to go through that, or especially because I'm a painter also, and I paint similarly in that I don't start with anything, and you know, you have to jump in, you know, and as you know, the longer you paint, you get to a point where you just have to trust that you're going to move, you know, in a way where something is going to arrive that you connect with and that feels very much yours. I think it's harder earlier on, but as your vocabulary and your, you know, the trust is very, I find is a very big component of, you know, the process unfolds, and, you know, it comes from, you know, so many places, but you need to allow for it to unfold and not stop it, you know, where you might initially, or if it does stop, then to kind of say, all right, let's just, you know.
I would like to add something to that, though,
Yeah.
in that I think paint is a very forgiving medium.
Yes.
In that I can totally, in 2 hours, I can totally change that painting.
Right, which is so wonderful.
You know,
right?
so it's so there's trust, but that doesn't always work.
No, right.
There's also failure.
Right, and you have to allow for change,
Yeah.
trust and change in this way.
But I think there's a difference between saying that you are unconscious or you're using things from your own unconsciousness, you know, that because there are things that.
Yeah, I think of it more as we are inhabited by myth, and
Did
so
you say myth?
myth, yeah, M-Y-T-H.
Oh, but yeah, and that's
and
that's a real James Hillman.
yeah, I know, yeah, and so that inflects us.
And so that, you know, you can have things from your dream.
Yeah,
state
yeah.
that you never bring into your own consciousness that can appear in your work on some level, and you might discover them. So that, you know.
And then also, yeah, and people.
I think that's more
you know,
like what Susan was talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Being
And I think what you
unconscious.
meant, is that what you meant?
Yeah,
That's what-
I'm
yeah,
art therapy,
me too.
so Freud,
Right.
unconscious.
Right.
And the Jungians.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
So with all this going on, how important then is experience, life experience? Because when you think about it, if you just lock yourself in your studio, right? What is there? But when you're out in the world, when you're reading, when you're going to this and going to that and seeing things and experiencing things, right? Because that's kind of when you're in that unknown area, it connects to something, you know, that's part of that experience, I think. So what are those things that you do?
That's why I rebelled against minimalism.
Yeah, right.
I started as a minimalist painter, actually.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't
I
know
am
that.
in the vein of like Jasper John.
Really?
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I garden. I do that.
That makes sense.
I think that's a lot like painting.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
cocooning said it could be from here to there, right? So it's not a matter of on the entire earth, but just what you get out of it.
So many things.
Yeah.
I've got this bug in my head now because of someone bringing up Guston. And Guston is such an outgrowth of expressionist painting and color and surface, and here comes this collision with graphic relationships and an imaginary or imaginal kind of condition. I'm not sure I'm gonna use that word right. But I'd be curious to hear what any of you would like to comment on, you know, what that approach might mean in context to what how you're approaching surface, and maybe Charles.
He's one of my heroes. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll just put that on the table there. Like he's one of the top heroes of mine. Because of his social consciousness, of just the mix of what he was doing, and like Guston, I'm trying to be funky. You know, it's like, I think that crusty funk is speaks to experience, it speaks to disappointment, it speaks to aspirations. You know, so I find that it's.
And when you say funk, you're talking about like Crazy Cat or, you know, something.
Oh
that's
yeah, I was
kind of
thinking also
social.
the surfaces are just
Okay.
encrusted. I'm thinking of funk as you know, just funk music. You know, yeah. So it's kind of rude. It's kind of
Yeah.
outlandish.
You think,
But you can also get lost in the color and the.
Oh
feelings.
and just a shoe, right? Or a guy smoking a cigar, you know. Yeah, he's been a huge influence on me. It was, talk about a transition from an abstract painter to a figurative painter.
It's like they were in there all along and they just came.
Yeah. Well, actually, he started, right, figuratively, and then went
Yeah.
abstract, and then
That's right.
came out. And I think in my journey, I was really into abstract painting. I mean, I put a lot of time into it, but it became increasingly, it's like, it's meaningless. You know, I couldn't connect any meaning to it. And then I realized, that we have a 1,000-year-old tradition of representation so a painting is a very false proposition. We don't see in rectangles, right? The outline of my vision is kind of like an oval, but we believe it. You know, I look at this landscape and it takes me into this space, but it's flat. So there's a lot of cultural things that we bring to looking at it. And I thought, well, if I draw a circle and put 2 dots and a line at the bottom, that's gonna look like a face. Okay, so that we have this convention that this geometric shape will look like a face. So I thought, oh, I'll use that. Why not? I mean, it's there. It's, why limit my vocabulary to sounds where I can make words?
Right.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize. I feel there's a lot of sort of 12th century in your vocabulary as well. Where
Speak
space,
of Bruegel?
or earlier, like the medieval,
right.
Where the definitions of space and architecture and imagination of, whether it's devils or rainbows or whatever, it's all fluid.
Yeah, my paintings are an occasion where I feel like I can be illogical and irrational, which may get to medieval weird logic or something. I'm mostly rational in my life. It's an opportunity to kind of critique rationality, actually. That's how I think of it.
Melissa?
I'm curious as to, I know you use watercolor, acrylic, and what got you to mixing mediums?
The different kind of, well, they're all water-based, which is good. And then there are certain ways that the paint hardly moves in these pools of water. So sometimes I'll just draw with water on the canvas. And none of these are on board, or is that one on board? That might be, yeah. So that one's on board. Usually they're stretched on board, overboard, so they're really like tabletop, like a floor or something. And so the water can just sit on the surface, essentially. So I can draw with water, and then I can drop paint in or pour paint in, and the paint will, kind of travel and do things. And ink and watercolor and acrylic move in different ways, and that was partly why ink in particular was a great asset for me. I would, it has these little I have these little droppers, and I'll, drop a little tincture of ink, and it'll just do all kinds of funny things, like this kind of thing, like that. Might have been made with just plain water, and then I just poured a little ink, and I just made that thing. I didn't have to touch it with a brush at all. Stuff like that. So that's how I started getting in. But the watercolor I use very sparingly because it's not very color. I mean, it's color fast, but it's pretty delicate, So, but I do it sometimes to jazz up some color, and so I'll use it.
I think when I think of the students, they take a painting class, they have their palette, their brushes, the easel is there, right? So they have a traditional way of working or drawing, right? But then there's a transition where now you're able to experiment, and then I think with the students, they look at a lot of the contemporary work like they're seeing now, and they're, how did you get to that? I only have a brush and my painting's in front of me on an easel, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm sure that they're wondering, how do I make that transition to where I can experiment?
Paint a lot.
Yeah.
No
Draw a
magic.
lot.
Tell them, yeah.
Draw a lot.
When I first got out of school, I told myself, I'm gonna make a major painting a month. I did a quota system. And it wasn't like, well, I would try to do the best I could, but I just wanna burn up painting, just, because the only thing that's gonna make me a better painter is to do more paintings. So how fast can I do this?
I think I told them this story. It came out of this David Sally book, How to See. He talks about how, I think it was in that book, there's a teacher who broke his class into two and told half of them that I guess they got a certain amount of time. Half of them, he wants them to make one, really finished work, and the other one, do as much work as you can, and he's gonna grade them. I guess he's gonna grade the ones that have to do a lot by how, like, the weight of them.
Oh, right, or how many or something,
And,
yeah.
and it's just like, the point was that the ones that had to produce a lot of work created so much more good work than even the one, the one painting. that-
Right, the masterpiece,
yeah,
right, yeah.
Masterpiece that wasn't actually such a masterpiece in the end.
I think the young, for sure, if you're young, urgency is your greatest asset, to discovery. Then the voice just kind of comes from that urgency. Just make and make and make lots and lots. Always follow every impulse, and
Dangerous.
good, bad. I knew a guy who used to bury his paintings in the ground. He mixed vegetable oil into his paint, and the worms would eat them, and he'd pull them out, and they had all kinds of rivulets, and they were covered with filth, and they were kind of good paintings, kind of bad, but like stuff like that, that's the way to go.
And 3 hours is not a lot of time to work on a painting.
I don't even go into the studio if I have 3 hours. Like
I know, it's not enough time.
Not worth it.
There was someone, I can't see.
Are there any like connections to your artwork?
Any
Connections.
connections to,
Like your artwork.
I'm sorry?
To your artwork. Are there any connections to your artwork?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by connections.
Connections between what?
Between,
Artwork and,
Like yourself.
oh, yeah, I mean, well, I would call it love-hate. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but many of my artist friends actually talk about, and this is just in light conversation, cocktail party conversation, talk about how much fun they have in the studio and stuff. And I think, and it's a privilege to be in the studio painting. I think we all think that way. This is what we live for, is to be in the studio painting. But for me, that's some of my worst times, is in the studio. This is an existential confrontation I'm having with myself, and it's not always pretty. And
you have to be a bit of a masochist.
yeah, and you definitely, for me anyway, I definitely am confronted with my failures, my inabilities, my disappointments.
and that's a really important thing that you have to, is what you probably have heard from every teacher you've had, risk-taking. You have to be willing to fail. You have to really put yourself on the line and be prepared to be disappointed, or else you're not gonna make anything that's worthwhile.
And the flip side of that is then when something works out, the reward. So I don't experience a lot of happiness in the studio, but I experience at times a tremendous amount of reward.
Yeah. I think that's just a really good way to put it, because nothing else explains, why
Why
we do it.
why?
Because it's, I mean, I don't feel happy, and sometimes, in the studio, a lot of the time, it's struggle, it's suffering. And then you finish something, and then, okay, now I have to go on to the next thing,
You think you can't do it again? That was,
No, really, do
I think, oh my God, I'll never be able to.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
this is-
there's a lot of that. But also just, the time to kind of, bathe in those, good feelings is short, because then you have to go on to the next thing. But there is a very rewarding feeling to doing something that, you feel good about, that you put yourself into, and you won again. Frank, I think after this question, we're gonna break.
I have another question for you, James.
Mhm.
Okay. back to, I forget her name, but she asked connections, but I've noticed that both, your paintings kind of use like these sort of circular motifs with these, circular strokes.
Right,
Instead of converge, is there like a connection to that?
Yeah.
Or-
They're kind of based on, I think of them as vibrations, vibration lines. You know, so if you were to, draw a radar or a microwave or something, so that's what they're meant to. I'm interested in painting the invisible, okay? And I feel like in this day and age, I feel like, wow, I know, I'm wearing a tinfoil hat now, but we're bombarded with like microwaves and cell phone signals and all this kind of stuff. And so, I kind of like that, that there's these invisible forces that are acting on us. Okay, so, and then as a painter, well, like on that one where I have these two overlapping circles that make kind of I call it a moire pattern. It's not really moire, but fake moire. But it can set up a sort of an optical vibration that I want to use that energizes surfaces.
And I think that talks about what, we're talking about whatever it was, I think talking about representation and things that are solid, that.
Yeah.
And you're talking about that, the fluidity between things that really exist, that we don't really see.
Yeah, and just invisible
Stuff.
And I think it's funny too. I mean,
I like that.
So, the artist will be here. If you have further questions, please do not hesitate to approach Charles, Susan, or Lowell and engage them in conversation, ask them any questions that you have. I want to thank them so much for coming out. So, stay around for a while. I hope.